I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, historian LaShawn Harris joins us to discuss her new book about Eleanor Bumpers, a black grandmother living in public housing in the Bronx, whose 1984 killing by the NYPD helped spark a citywide movement for justice and police reform. But first, as the mayoral race enters its final stretch, we ask, can the progressive agenda deliver real solutions for New York's economic challenges? To discuss how these ideas collide and coexist, we're joined by Matthew Haag, whose latest reporting examines the challenges facing our city's recovery. In studio, my colleague Dana Rubinstein, with whom I recently reported about Mamdani's public break from the socialist platform. Welcome to both of you guys.
Hi.
Good to be here.
So, Dana, there's been a lot of developments around the mayoral race. What's happened recently? Mayor Adams is still in it at the moment?
Yeah, it seems like things are moving very quickly. Eric Adams is still in it at the moment. He himself is staying still when talking about whether he is still running for re-election. So he is himself seemingly modifying his language in a way that's very suggestive. You know, we had an independent party candidate drop out this week, Jim Walden. And then Mamdani, the current frontrunner, is, you know, like many candidates in his position in a general election, moderating, including distancing himself from the national DSA platform.
Yeah, tell us a little more. First, Mayor Adams, there were conversations that he may be getting a job in the Trump administration?
The Trump administration officials and people in his world are talking about finding jobs for Eric Adams and for Curtis Sliwa, and thereby, who's the Republican candidate for mayor, and thereby clearing the field for Andrew Cuomo.
And so, Matthew, you know, the mayor's race is moving forward. You know, Mamdani's platform is about affordability. I'm wondering what kind of economy might he inherit if he is to win the election?
Jeff, I think the best way to describe the economy right now, like 5.5 years after the pandemic hit, and New York City, of course, was hit the hardest in the country, and it's been a slow climb out, is that it's been going sideways. And there's a lot of inequality that's emerged. Wage growth, job growth on the high end has been robust, with record Wall Street bonuses for several years during the pandemic, but then largely no growth in middle class jobs and strong growth in lower paying jobs like home health aides. And it's really healthcare and the healthcare system and sector that's been robust in lifting up the larger labor market. The city's added, and Adams likes to tout that they have record number of jobs under his administration. And while that's true, the city's gained 160,000 jobs since right before the pandemic hit. In a couple of years before Adams and before the pandemic, it wasn't uncommon to have 80 to 100,000 in a year. And so it does feel like the labor market, not just right now, but for the coming out of the pandemic, has been very slow and sluggish. And people I interview who are looking for jobs feel like they never hear back from anybody. They feel like people are cutting back on openings and vacancies. And it just feels like the economy is not going in the right direction.
And so Eric Adams has talked about his accomplishments in terms of jobs and unemployment levels, but Mamdani's platform, focusing on affordability, was immensely popular. I'm wondering if you think, is there any truth to Mayor Adams's claims of how he's helped the city economy? Has that helped him with voters at all?
I mean, very little seems to be helping him with voters right now. His numbers are consistently in the single digits when he's, you know, set up against his mayoral rivals. I mean, yeah, he has presided over a city whose economy has rebounded some since the pandemic, and where crime has fallen some since the pandemic, and he does have, you know, accomplishments under his belt. But I think that the corruption scandals that have plagued his administration have left a taste in people's mouths that that he can't seem to get rid of.
Mayor Adams also talks about his plans for the city if reelected. He was one of the people who called for people to come back to the office after the pandemic. But your article talks about a shift in office work. What's happening in the city in terms of people going into their offices?
Well, there's definitely a permanent shift in the way people work, not just in New York City, but around the country. after the pandemic. Hybrid remote work is embraced, but people are by and large in New York City are coming back, sort of the office going sector. They are going back to the office at least 3, 4 days a week, sometimes 5 in some sectors like real estate. And so there has been a stronger return to office. It is still down from 2019, for instance. And leasing for office space, which is a metric that real estate industry looks at, it has been quite strong this year. There's a lot of concern about, whether that will continue. And part of that's driven by there's no really buildings under construction. JP Morgan's building is about to go up, and that's really the last large building that's under construction. So there's feeling that there'll be little supply going forward, and perhaps that's behind the rush. But there is a shift in office type jobs. So that's investment banks, media, accounting. Those jobs are actually, there's fewer right now than there were at the start of the year, which is not what you would think is the right way to go. There's 1.5 million jobs, and those are sort of the backbone of the economy in New York City. And so that has been slow, and what that's attributed to, whether it's Trump's economic policies, the sort of emergence of AI putting a pause on new hiring, there is definitely a slowdown that is not a continuation of the growth that we've had before.
And your article points out that even though the healthcare sector, for example, seems to be still growing, those jobs that are being created are lower end home health aid jobs, that pay, $30,000 a year or so. Those are not the kind of jobs that most cities are necessarily looking for, right?
No, they are low-paying jobs. I think it's about $33,000 a year on average, which is far below the median wage in the city. And what you see is those are booming, while some other sort of entry jobs in the past, retail is down, hospitality, tourism is down from before the pandemic. And so you start to see shifts 5.5 years after the pandemic that you wonder, are these sort of a permanent shift? You see the vacant retail stores around the city. So retail jobs are down. Those used to be an entry job that paid decently well, a lot higher than home health care. And tourism has taken a hit. It was supposed to be a record year this year. And there are fewer jobs now than at the beginning of the year. And there are fewer tourists right now than at the beginning of the year.
One issue that has come up in the mayor's race, and either of you can feel free to answer this, is Trump and his seeming interest, involvement in the race. We know that his administration pardoned or dropped the charges against Mayor Adams, and now there's talk that maybe Mayor Adams will drop out of the race and go work for the Trump administration. I'm wondering the effect of Trump and some of the cuts. We've seen cuts to Medicaid, other social service programs. Is there any talk in the mayor's race about how they will handle that, dealing with the Trump administration?
Surprisingly, no, not on the budgetary front. But there's no question the state will be facing huge deficits that will impact New York City. To the extent people are talking about Trump, it's more about the immigration stuff, the ongoing detention of people showing up for their scheduled hearings at 26 Federal Plaza. And also the prospect that he will send National Guard troops to New York City like he's threatening to do to Chicago. And whether the mayor, whoever it is, will have any impact on that prospect. Cuomo argues that if Mamdani becomes mayor, Trump's just going to immediately send troops to New York City, whereas if he remains or becomes mayor, then he will, somehow be able to prevent that from happening.
And Matthew, you spoke to some business leaders for your article. I'm wondering, have they give you any thoughts about the mayor's race? I know early on you had leaders in real estate, business, sort of raising concerns about Mamdani and some of his policies and, backing former Governor Andrew Cuomo. What are these leaders worried about in your conversations with them?
Well, I think real estate in particular is concerned about Mamdani's rent freeze, which would affect about 1 million rent stabilized units in the city and perhaps changing the way real estate is built in the city. So you hear a lot of concerns from them. And then also on the tax front, because a lot of his policies would require increasing the tax rate on the high end, so any income above $1 million. And of course, that would require Kathy Hochul's approval, so that's to be determined. But you hear a lot of sort of skies falling that would be the last straw, that millionaires and those type of business leaders would simply pick up their bags and move elsewhere. And that's been a refrain that's existed for a long time in New York City, But you hear Andrew Cuomo saying such things that businesses would move to Florida, and some have over the years, like finance to Palm Beach. But by and large, they are still operating here. And so there's a lot of sort of claims and wild claims that people would leave, and then so what would be left because they are such an important tax base. And so it's Mamdani's not there yet, and so it's who knows whether he would be able to increase that high tax rate. But that's the concern, that they would drive business out. And as Dana said, it's the capitalist capital of the world. And so what's left in New York City if they leave?
As some of our reporting shows, Mamdani has sort of moderated his positions on some of these issues, right? When it comes to, taxes, defunding the police, he's tried to moderate some of that, especially with the business leaders.
Right. Well, business leaders take public safety extremely seriously. And yeah, so he has, in the past, he's called for defunding the police. He's affiliated with the DSA, whose national platform calls for gradually zeroing out police department budgets. He has backed away from all of that. He said the national DSA platform is not my platform, and I no longer want to defund the police. And he's moderated in some other areas too. He formally called for getting rid of the specialized high school exam, and no longer does call for that. He has sort of called for people to not use the term globalize the intifada, which was a sort of moderating step for him. So yeah, I mean, he's definitely, and he's also been meeting with business leaders, with the Partnership for New York City, with the Real Estate Board of New York, with some sort of supermarket association. So he is making overtures in an effort to sort of tamp down some of the concern.
Yeah, and what about those concerns? Do you think they're realistic? People have raised concerns because he is a Democratic socialist, and how he would affect. Are those real concerns, or are those more concerns coming from his opponents like Governor Cuomo, who's raised that issue?
I mean, it's interesting. If you talk to the people who work in real estate but deal with the government, who work in government relations, as it's called, they're not all that concerned. They kind of see him as someone who is very much a child of the elite, much like many of these people raising concerns, and who is like a reasonable human being who, is young and held some views that, young people often hold, but is clearly evolving. But then there are people who don't deal with government at all, who are in those communities, who I think, like the Bill Ackmans of the world, for example, who are I think, very alarmed and alarmist.
Matthew, have you heard at all from business leaders about their response to Mamdani? Are they concerned? Do they feel better about his positions?
Well, I think that he's going to have a difficult time raising sort of the high tax rate. And so I think it's easy to say now that he's going to be devastating for the economy, when really it's going to be quite hard for him to do these type of things that he wants to do. And so I think, of course, they would prefer a different candidate, but they tend to find a way to work within the realms of whoever's in office. Just look at Trump. People have adapted to his sort of the way he operates. And so I think that right now it's easy to go on and say that he's going to devastate the economy, but things tend to be able to work out. And Mamdani does seem to be moderating and listening and talking to these groups. And so it's not like he's standoffish. And so I think they find him somewhat receptive to their thoughts and concerns. And he seems to be saying that he's listening.
We'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Matthew and Dana, for your insight into a race that not only has New Yorkers, but the whole world watching. Coming up next, acclaimed historian and author LaShawn Harris joins us to share the powerful story of Eleanor Bumpers, a case that still resonates deeply with New Yorkers and their ongoing struggle for justice in our city. I'm now joined by historian and author LaShawn Harris. Her latest book, Tell Her Story, released just last week, offers a powerful, thoroughly researched look at Eleanor Bumpers, a Bronx grandmother whose killing by NYPD officers in 1984 sent shockwaves through the city, sparking protests and igniting a citywide reckoning about police violence, mental health, and the unique vulnerabilities Black women face. LaShawn, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about Eleanor Bumpers, who she was, what happened, and what sparked you to spend several years researching and writing this book?
Thank you for that question. Eleanor Bumpers was a child of the South. She was born in 1918. She comes to New York City during the Second Great Migration. Has, a bit of struggles throughout the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. She's a single mother with about just 7 children, and suffers from, a little bit of mental health. I'm not exactly sure what conditions in particular, but has mental health issues. And in 1984, she's killed by the NYPD. This is during a housing eviction.
Wow. And so police came to her door to evict her, and what happened from there?
She was behind in her rent. She had stopped, the eviction happened on October 29th, 1984, and she had stopped paying rent in July 1984. And housing proceedings for eviction was imminent for her. And part of the housing procedure is to have the housing police there while someone is being evicted. But because Housing Authority believed that Eleanor Bumpers was violent, they had the emergency service unit there at the same time. And there's some, disputable, debates about exactly what happened, but they went into her apartment and they shot her twice.
And were the officers punished?
The officer that shot her does not go to trial until 1987. He was indicted in January of 1985. So it's a 3-year legal battle to get him to court in 1987.
And this was a particularly brutal case, right? Because the officer shot her with a shotgun, right? And that caused a lot of outrage because Eleanor was a grandmother at the time, or?
Eleanor was about 66 years old, and she, again, she had, 7 children. She was a grandmother also. She was a public assistance recipient, and this was a grandmother. So many people were just totally outraged, how could police go in with so much weaponry? But this particular police unit, the emergency service unit, is trained to go in and handle folks who have mental health issues, and they are known to carry a lot of weaponry on them. So them going into her apartment with the shotgun was not unusual for that particular police unit.
Your book talks about how what happened with Eleanor Bumpers was really a collision of sort of the sort of housing circumstances that she was facing, and also the sort of over-policing, the militarization of police that we've been seeing. Talk about that. How did those two things play out and result in the death of Eleanor Bumpers?
It's really like a brewing storm where you have a mix of. This is a time where the most vulnerable populations of people, including people with mental health issues, people who live in public housing projects, people who are on public assistance, where resources are being taken away from. This is the age of Reaganomics. During the 70s, New York City underwent a physical crisis where city services were cut, and Eleanor suffered from those. So even before police stepped into her door, stepped into her apartment, she had already been a victim of federal disinvestment and also municipal disinvestment. So that combined with this idea that she was violent, that she was a threat to her neighbors, that she was a threat to herself, kind of, it was this kind of perfect storm, and it came combined and had drastic effects for her.
And the fact that Eleanor was a Black woman, what role do you think that played in both her circumstances and her death?
That was the question during the 1980s, and it's still a question now. And one could say if this was an elderly white woman who lived on the Upper West Side or East Side, would she have gotten the same type of, treatment? Would she have been killed? And I tend to think probably not. When they went in and they were tried to evict Eleanor as well as, shoot her, they didn't necessarily see a grandmother or a mother. They saw a threat, right? Any type of manufactured ideas about who they thought she was, was more imminent than this person is someone who is in need of compassion, perhaps, mental health services, and really a post eviction process. Because even in the the attempt to evict her, the city never put forth a post-eviction plan for her. So it makes you think, you know, how do you just throw out someone, particularly someone who has mental health issues and someone who is a grandmother? Like, where did they really think that she was going to go?
Right. And so Eleanor has become this symbol of what happens when, you know, there's dysfunction. But I mean, tell me a little bit more about Eleanor personally. Like, you know, you don't really hear much about her as an individual.
Yeah, I really wanted to tell this story because, just broadly speaking, when we think about police shooting victims, we tend to think of them in terms of hashtags, and we tend to think of them, you know, about cell phone video footage. And I really wanted to go like beyond the hashtags. I want people to invest in the many different lives that folks lived. But Eleanor, you know, she was a sweet woman. She loved to dance. She loved to cook. She loved her children fiercely. And this is someone who really had hopes and dreams for herself and her children, despite all of the urban inequalities that were surrounding her. But this was an ordinary Black woman who was trying to survive in a world of a lot of obstacles. But the thing that I found out that was most enduring about her was that she loved her children fiercely. And even as a working class, working poor family, they did things around the house, they did things around the city. And I think that that's what people should really think about, like victims and the complex lives that they lived.
What I found interesting about your book is that you actually lived across the street from Eleanor Bumpers, right? Was that the Morris Heights neighborhood?
That's the Morris Heights neighborhood. She lived in Sedgwick Houses, and I lived directly across the street. When she was killed, I was 10 years old, and my family and her daughter, Mary, who's the second daughter who becomes the activist, she had a dog. So my family and her family, like our dogs would, you know, play together. And I remember that moment when that week that she was killed, because it was October 29th, and it was a couple of days before Halloween. And we had spent, you know, that week thinking about going trick-or-treating, going across the street to the projects, just kind of going around the neighborhood. And that year we couldn't go because of the shooting. What happened in the neighborhood was a whole bunch of reporters, such as Jimmy Breslin, police were around, just trying to understand what happened. So we had to trick-or-treat in the apartment building versus going outside and trick-or-treating. And
you were 10 at the time, but
yeah.
I'm wondering what effect her death may have had on you, like personally, like,
yeah.
And secondly, like, is this something that just sort of stayed with you? Because obviously you wrote about this,
yeah.
you know, decades later.
It did. You know, my first book was on New York City and the underground economy during the 1920s and 30s. I deal with underground people, madams, pimps, hustlers, those type of folks. But I was looking for another project to work on, and I said I'll just look at Eleanor Bumpers just as an article, which came out in 2017 sometime. And I really wanted to do something on Black women in policing and other women that were killed by the police during the 1980s. There's so much conversations about Michael Stewart and Edmund Perry and others. I wanted to do something on women, and I figured, you know, just focus on one case. And as I was talking to my mom, she was just telling me all of these stories about the neighborhood, and I was like, okay. And just growing up, you know, you constantly see this image of Eleanor Bumpers that was produced by the New York Daily News in 1981. It's kind of iconic image of her. I've grown up with that picture. The film Do the Right Thing was dedicated to Eleanor Bumpers and Edmund Perry and Michael Stewart and all of those who, you know, were lost to police violence. And we eventually moved from that community. We moved down the street, not too far from Bronx Community College. And Mary Bumpers, who had also moved, lived around the corner. And I didn't even know that until I started, you know, doing interviews with her. So I feel like, you know, it was my story to kind of tell. I was the right person to tell the story just because of the geographical connections, but also the emotional ties to the community and to the case.
And we've seen other police killings make the news. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. I'm wondering if Eleanor Bumpers had happened today, or what was the difference in the response back then from what we might see today?
I think one of the differences is that you see more and more family activists coming out and telling those personal stories. And the point of the personal narrative is to galvanize support for any type of social justice movement, any type of legal justice movement, but to galvanize empathy for those movements and for those people, right? It's also to show the impact or the aftershocks of police violence on families. Like, that's what we're seeing now. During the 80s, unless, Mary Bumpers and her family was being interviewed by like the black press, the New York Amsterdam News or the City Sun, you didn't get that really in mainstream newspapers. It was just these kind of salacious details about Eleanor Bumpers and assumptions that were really taken from police reports, which have to be interrogated also, right? So I think the difference is now we hear those stories. So you can't really look at that videotape of George Floyd and not think about his personal life. And more people are writing those stories. Another difference is that family activists are coming out and writing memoirs. So we have the memoir of Trayvon Martin by his parents. We have a memoir by Gwen Carr of her son Eric Gardner. We have Eric Gardner's daughter Emerald Gardner. We have so many. We have Ryan Coogler's Fruitville Station, which is about Oscar Grant. So we have all of these different types of texts and narratives. We didn't really have that back in the 1980s. There was really no media platform for families and friends to come out and tell a story that kind of deviated from a police narrative or a narrative about like violence and destruction.
And quickly, Mary, her daughter, right, became an activist behind this. What quickly is the legacy of what happened to Eleanor Bumpers? Has anything changed in the city? How police deal with people who have housing? Has housing policy changed? What's the legacy of what?
That's a hard question. That's a great question. Yes, I think policies have changed. I mean, you have the Be Heard, a program, but at the same time, people still continue to die. I'm thinking about Deborah Danner in 2016, another elderly Bronx woman with, who was living with mental health issues. I'm thinking about the young teenage boy in, I think this was in Queens, when Rosario, also someone who was killed by the police. The parents, I think the family called in and said, don't tell the police to come here. They end up coming there, and he ends up being shot. So I think that policies change. They become these kind of knee-jerk reactions to these incidents, but people still are continuing to die, which means that perhaps there should be something different as a city and as a society that we should be doing when it comes to persons living with mental health issues.
We'll end on that note. Thank you, LaShawn, for this important book, for your ongoing dedication to historical truth and justice. That's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff Mays. Don't forget to download the CUNY TV app, where you can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.